The fact that a river doesn't separate a people.
America is a melting pot. Canada is a mosaic.
Welcome to This Week Uncut, where we take a look at the top stories from CHCO-TV and The Courier. I'm Nathalie Sturgeon.
And I'm Vicki Hogarth.
So Vicki, you started your news week in St. Stephen at a solidarity rally with our American friends.
It was a really beautiful event to attend. It took place at the waterfront in St. Stephen, right by the famous lighthouse. And it was on International Women's Day, so last weekend. And while it did mark International Women's Day, it was an event that was really in support of women's freedoms, human rights in general. What we saw at this event was an opportunity to also celebrate Canadian sovereignty. And the most touching thing about it was how many Americans came over from Washington County, Maine, to be a part of the demonstration. So we spoke to a number of Americans at the event, which was really interesting. For instance, there's a lady named Anne Lever, who's from Eastport, Maine. She told us that she looks out on Campobello Island every morning and she sees friends. That's what she sees when she looks across the border.
And you also talked to some folks who are concerned about how they're receiving their energy as part of Northern Maine is supplied by NB Power.
What was neat about that was exactly learning firsthand from people who are affected by this trade war in ways that I think not everyone, especially people that don't live in border communities, fully understand the way this affects lives of people just along the border. Paul Strickland's from Robbinston, Maine. So if you live in St. Andrews, I can look out my window and see Robbinston, Maine. That's how close it is to us. And Paul was telling us that he's on New Brunswick's power grid. So he stands in solidarity with his neighbors in Canada for many reasons, but he did discuss how if this trade war escalates, if we see premiers, we know Doug Ford has talked about this, as Ontario is potentially just cutting off power. He mentioned that if this is a similar move that's made in New Brunswick, it would impact him for that exact reason. He's on the power grid supplied by our province. So we spoke with Paul. If you saw the news, you saw a short clip, but I'd love to play a longer clip of that, because what was also interesting about Paul is if you followed a news story we did, I can't remember how many weeks back, it was like 5 or 6 weeks back, where we did Lights Across the Border. It was another event in the same location in the evening, where it was in support of human rights again. A lot of concern, especially towards the trans community, with some of the moves that are being made in the United States right now and how it might affect trans people's lives. What happened was an event that was organized in St. Stephen by Tracy Matheson and members of Charlotte County Pride to shine lights across the border to show Americans that we stand with them. What we weren't expecting at that event were lights to shine back from the U.S. side. And in the interview that we did with Paul this week, he mentioned he was one of those lights shining back from the get-go from Calais. So he was at the rally on the St. Stephen side this time, and this is what he had to say.
About what brought you over from Robbinston. Why was it important to come today?
Well, first off, there was an invitation that was passed on to me. I'm not quite sure where it came from, but we met with a group earlier about a month ago of people on both sides of the river. At that time, everyone was holding their flashlights and cameras and waving to each other, and it was just a marvelous feeling to experience the solidarity that existed and the fact that a river doesn't separate a people. But these tariffs could have an impact on both sides of the river. And we recognize that. We're where we live, just across the river, we're on the Canadian energy grid. So, any tariff that are enacted are going to impact us as well. Oil, gasoline, our lobstermen are going to be affected because, so much of the processing of lobster takes place in Canada, not in Maine.
That was Paul Strickland speaking with CHCO-TV's Vicki Hogarth. And, you know, Premier Holt talked about this in a press conference she held on Thursday, which she says that she intends to do every Thursday as this trade war kind of unfolds. And she talked about that complicated decision to take power away from Northern Maine. It's not just as simple as saying we're going to shut the power off, right? It's about impacting folks who access that power. It's about Canadian or American health centers that Canadians use, jobs that are over there that Canadians use as well. So I wondered, you were a part of that press conference, and what were your thoughts on what she said about how we respond directly to these tariffs?
I thought it was interesting that she mentioned, just from a human perspective, how unfair that could be to people that we do consider our neighbors and friends. I think in a lot of ways the state of Maine has tried to stand up to this trade war and many of some of the human rights issues that are occurring in the United States right now. So I think that Premier Holt sees cutting off the power as a direct attack on Maine, when I think where the issues she sees really do come from Washington. So why would we wage war with our American neighbors? Another point that she brought up is the fact that if we cut off the power, that could create a non-reliance on New Brunswick energy going forward. So for the short-term game of making a move in this trade war, would it be worth the long-term implications of cutting the power so easily? When you take a move like that, that means down the road, could you be trusted if there's another administration that creates a similar move? So do we want to make that bold step now for what might make an immediate impact on the trade war for long-term implications?
And when U.S. President Donald Trump announced that he would have tariffs on steel and aluminum, Doug Ford's response, the Premier of Ontario, was to say, okay, well, we're going to cut the power. And that actually did get the attention of the Trump administration. And then he, sort of said he was going to retaliate and increase the tariff. But I think that the power grid that Ontario is supplying to Minnesota, Michigan, and New York is very different from what's happening in New Brunswick. New Brunswick has a much smaller population they're taking care of. There could be a closure of Maine on their grid. They could just say, okay, never mind, we're not going to do that anymore. And that would be to the economic disadvantage of New Brunswick.
I thought it was interesting from Premier Ford's point of view, though. This was the first time I think we've heard Donald Trump describe the retaliations of Canadians as unfair. So obviously it didn't go through, but it's still on the table in a lot of ways. We'll have to continue to follow this issue. But as Nathalie mentioned, these press conferences, Premier Holt said she will be holding them now every Thursday at noon going forward. She will deliver remarks, take questions from journalists, similar to COVID-19 in a lot of ways as we think back to those regular updates we had. She said she plans to do this for as long as the trade war continues. Here is Premier Susan Holt at Chancery Place in Fredericton delivering her opening remarks.
I have been getting your messages, your emails, your phone calls, and hearing from you in the community about how you're feeling about what we're going through. And so I wanted to speak directly to New Brunswickers to acknowledge that we hear you feeling unrest, uncertain about what's happening, feeling frustrated, angry by what's happening in the U.S., feeling scared about what this means for our province and our future. Je voulais vraiment nommer.
I would like to mention the emotions that are heard from New Brunswickers who are feeling uncertain, who feel anxiety related to their jobs, to their community, to the province and our country. I would like to be here to recognize your emotions and also to validate them.
It's clear that we are going through something that is unprecedented, that New Brunswick has never experienced before. And so it is normal that many people are feeling scared and unsure. It is completely normal that many of us are feeling angry and frustrated at what is happening with the US and with our economy and on a number of different files. So the purpose of me being here today is really to speak to some of those frequently asked questions that I receive from New Brunswickers, to talk about the things that you want to talk about, and to provide a forum for regular communication during a time of consistent uncertainty. The one thing that is consistent is the uncertainty that we know is happening. C'est clairement un temps.
It is clearly a uncertain time, so I wanted to acknowledge your feelings and ensure a communication method between New Brunswickers and the government to talk about these issues.
Every Thursday at noon for the coming weeks until we are through this period of uncertainty and disruption and past the threat that New Brunswickers are currently feeling to their jobs, to their communities, and to their way of life. The content may change week on week, and maybe some weeks we won't have much of an update to give, but we'll be here anyway to talk to you and let you know what's going on. Clearly, since the last time I was sitting here on Tuesday of a little more than a week ago, we had tariffs imposed by the U.S. that were very shortly removed. And then we had aluminum tariffs come back and get imposed on March 12th. Suggested that they would be doubled, but they're in place at 25%. Now we have Chinese tariffs that have shown up in the marketplace to be put on very shortly. And so the situation is changing on a regular basis, but your team in government is on top of it. And I want to make sure New Brunswickers know that we've got your back. We are focused on making sure that our province gets through this period of uncertainty as best we can all together.
That was Premier Susan Holt delivering opening remarks at a press conference that she will be holding for the next foreseeable future. But it is worth noting that she didn't really announce anything new in that press conference. She didn't add any additional tariffs. She didn't add any additional measures. And now New Brunswick and many other provinces and territories are in a holding pattern, waiting to see what U.S. President Donald Trump and his administration are going to do next, right?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the point of that press conference was really to announce these recurring press conferences, to say, we will be here for you, to take your questions. And on that note, we'd love to hear from you at home. What are your questions? We will be a part of these conferences every Thursday. So you can always email our entire news team at news@chco.tv. We will go through your questions as we did in the time of COVID-19 to see what matters most to our community. I know that most of the journalists I found in this press conference, they were concerned with power. The idea of whether or not this was on the table, that was a big debate. For us, we were more concerned with Campobello Island at this time. That was our first question in the conference, was asking about islanders who have been immediately affected by these tariffs. We know that just from their unique geography. We went over this last week. The islanders really have no choice but to buy many of their groceries and day-to-day essentials over in Lubec, Maine, and then bring them back into Canada. Now, what we've heard from islanders is this is causing not just long lines at their border, but item by item, groceries are being gone through, and tariffs are being applied accordingly. Now, this can get very expensive when you think it's things like yogurt, day-to-day essentials that they're having to pay these tariffs on. We have a choice whether we go over or not to buy things maybe you can't get in Canada. I went over this week just to see what the experience was like. Spent $20 on socks, of all things. And on $20 of socks, I paid almost $9 in tariffs, plus another $5 in tax, and then add to that, when you convert into Canadian, it was $31. So it was really just to give you an idea of what it's like crossing the border for something you may have crossed easily for before.
And that's not an experience I think Charlotte County residents would be used to, right? I've just moved here and I've only ever gone across the border a couple of times, as you have encouraged me to go, and a lot of people talk about some of the stores over there. But it's usually you go through, it's kind of calm and easy. They ask you the usual questions, but I think the experience of being brought into to the customs office would be very jarring for folks in Charlotte County who are not used to that type of interaction.
The reason I did a $20 flat, it was $10 for 2 packs of socks. The reason I buy these socks is because they make all my socks match. And I thought, why not? Why not try this out on a small purchase and see what happens? $20 is usually the limit. If you're crossing the border, you don't get pulled in. It's not really worth the processing. By the time it comes out, I think they lose money on processing, $20 in normal times. But this week, very different. You go in to pay your tariffs on $20, and on top of the fact that you have all these additional expenses, it also is a much longer line to get through. Even even if it doesn't seem like there's a lot of people crossing the border, it can take that added time because everyone's going in to have their receipts item by item gone through. So it's a very different experience. It explains why when you look across Canada, traffic's down at land borders in particular. I know that air traffic, I think spring break, it doesn't seem like there's that big of a decrease at this point in time. I think it's something we'll see as the coming months when people aren't booking trips. Some of these trips, I imagine, were maybe prepaid and non-refundable. When you're wondering why you see a lot of people still traveling by plane to the U.S. But in terms of traffic at land borders, St. Stephen Milltown is down 24%. At the commercial bridge, the third bridge, it's down 15%. But then if you go to Campobello, it's only down 6% because of their heavy reliance on getting necessities from the U.S. So it's interesting to consider that geography and what it means depending on which crossing you're using.
It's a very delicate situation. I think Canadians want to support their American counterparts, and I think vice versa as well. Americans want to support Canadians. And I think the critical point will be getting that message to the Trump administration. I don't think that locally these decisions are being made to punish us. I think whatever happens here the message has to be delivered to the White House.
Mm-hmm. And I think that we deliver a special message here in New Brunswick and Maine because we showcase as well that friendship. It's very easy, I think, for a Canadian that doesn't have that border town experience to say, let's just cut it all off. Let's cut off power. Let's never go over. But when you live in an area like ours where there's relationships on both sides of the border, it really changes things. It changes how you perceive this trade war and how you're going to react to it as well. I don't think that cutting off power for every New Brunswicker when you have family on the other side really makes the same amount of sense it might make to someone who has no relationship with the U.S.
And Premier Holt did take questions from journalists about the ongoing trade war between Canada and the U.S.
Has or will your government back out of already signed contracts with U.S. companies, and if so, how many?
You're piggybacking on the question of Jacques that I didn't get to the end of. So that procurement has been going through all of our contracts with the U.S. and to determine whether we can get out of them, whether we have an alternative supplier, and what that process, what the fees to cancel a contract might look like, what it might cost us to move the business to another one. So I don't have all of the details of the fact that there's 72 of them and these ones we can't and these ones we can, but I can get some more detail for you on that.
Thank you. We're going online. Vicki Hogarth, CHCO.
Thank you, Bruce. Premier Holt, last week I reached out to CBSA to see if there are any tariff exemptions for Campobello Islanders who rely on getting certain day-to-day essentials from Maine. CBSA redirected me to the Federal Department of Finance, who said they're aware of the situation on the island and they will get back to me, but they haven't yet. Meanwhile, Islanders are now facing long lines at the border where grocery store items are being looked at item by item and tariffed accordingly. I'm just wondering if there's any new information that we can give to Islanders that might alleviate some of the added stresses that they're feeling.
Thank you for the question, Vicki, because you're right to call out the fact that the folks in Campobello have it harder than pretty much any other New Brunswicker right now, and often feel overlooked and forgotten about because of their unique situation and the fact that they have no other choice but to go into the U.S. for a lot of the daily goods and necessities that they have. And I'm sorry to hear that you didn't get the response you were looking for from the federal government, but we can try to help you out with that and to help out the folks in Campobello. I know our Minister of Local Government was talking to the mayor in Campobello and I think is going there tomorrow. Actually, I think Minister Kennedy is going to be in Campobello tomorrow, but let me just double check to confirm that, to get on the ground with those folks and see if we can more successfully advocate with the federal government to get the kind of conditions around the necessities that don't hammer the people of Campobello the way that they're experiencing right now.
Follow up, Ms. Hogarth?
Thank you for that. And the Prime Minister, he's openly suggested that Trump is trying to use economic force to annex Canada. You touched on this today, too. Is this a sentiment among premiers and among federal ministers that the U.S. president's motivations with these tariffs might be to annex our country? And if so, should we be more vocal about this on the world stage? Is it time?
Oh, actually, I think there's a lot of conversations happening on the world stage with our partners in Europe and the UK and in Asia and other places about what the president has clearly stated is his intent to reset the global order, and that we are not the only people in his sights as he talks about Greenland and other places. And so the premiers, as well as the prime minister, take very seriously the threat that the president has issued about wanting to annex Canada. It will never happen, and we've made it quite clear that Canada is not having those conversations and will defend at every step our sovereignty, and with allies around the world that are communicating the same messages to the White House about their territories and countries. It is absolutely something we should take seriously, but I think the U.S. is starting to feel the repercussions of those decisions as they see purchase of U.S. goods tanking around the world. Canada isn't the only place that has stopped buying U.S. Their opportunity to procure some of the resources and services they need to achieve their interests have dried up completely. And so I think that the White House is in they're spiraling a bit and challenged to have rhetoric match action, and the people around the president are trying to find their way through this. But Canada is clear in its resolve to defend our sovereignty, and we have allies around the world that will back us up on that, and that we will be there for them as well.
That was Premier Susan Holt taking questions from journalists at a press conference on Thursday. And I think Campobello will remain top of mind for us as we navigate this trade war. As someone who's lived here for a considerable amount of time and understands the dynamics at play here, what do you hope that we could achieve for the folks out in Campobello Island?
I hope ultimately, I really do, I hope that shining a light on yet another issue. We've gone through COVID-19 and what Campobello had to go through then. We've gone through issues of following ballots for elections that used to be transported through the U.S., and if you think about that, that doesn't make sense. Things like mail as well, to having those ballots boated across from St. Andrews to Campobello. We've dealt with many situations just at CHCO and the Courier following the complications of not having year-round access to the rest of Canada. And now we're given this trade war as another reason why this is complicated. So I think if we can keep shining a light on these issues, I know with COVID-19, the province did step up, did fund the privately operated East Coast ferries to run year-round. Now that ferry, it's a wonderful ferry. I'm so happy it exists. It's possibly not the best ferry in winter months because that's not what it's designed for. It's meant for the tourism season. So I think islanders are really looking at something that could be reliable day to day, the way Grand Manan has wonderful ferries that run all year round. That's what the island is really looking for. It's to feel that the next time something like this happens, we've seen a pandemic now, a trade war. What will be next? There will be something next. That's what we can guarantee, that they'll need this link to the mainland for. So if we can keep putting a spotlight on this issue, we know there will be more issues. So I think that's ultimately what islanders are looking for. And while short-term solutions can be a Band-Aid in times of need, they are looking for that long-term solution. That means whatever comes next, they'll be ready for it.
Right, exactly. And I it's interesting that you say, we've had so many things happen. We can't wait until the next thing happens. I think there needs to be a conversation around how the federal and provincial governments could partner up and figure out a way to have Campobello Island have access to the mainland without needing to go through the U.S.
Mm-hmm. And that's and top of mind for islanders too right now is fine. They're dealing with their own headaches of dealing with tariffs. But what's the next concern? The next concern is the tourism of summer. That is, in this part of the world, this whole region, it's our bread and butter when it comes to people visiting. Campobello Island, again, has a unique circumstance where the majority of their visitors do come from the U.S. We don't know yet what that means for this summer. We know in COVID-19, a place like St. Andrews tended to get busier because Canadians were staying in their own country. But a place like Campobello that's so heavily reliant on the U.S. traffic, particularly coming to the International Park, FDR's former summer residents, for a part of their own history, they are worried about what it's going to mean this summer. So we'll continue to follow that issue as well. We are going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we will take a closer look at the Starshine properties in St. Stephen, as well as the latest scan operation to take place on Mark Street.
Another issue more locally that has been on our agenda is Starshine Properties. We've had a third property now that has been subject to a SCAN investigation. And for those who don't know, SCAN is the Safer Communities and Neighborhoods Act, which was brought into fruition through the previous progressive conservative government. 16 and 9 Scudic Street were the first two properties that were the subject of SCAN-based investigations, and they were also seized by the Department of Justice and Public Safety. What stood out to you in terms of the story that the Courier published earlier this week?
Well, I want to commend you on a job well done in terms of your reporting on 18 Mark Street and the latest SCAN operation under Starshine Properties. It's something we've been covering now for quite almost 2 years, the issues that are happening with Starshine Properties. I think what stood out to me, though, is we don't have a Facebook page for CHCO right now, given the news block by Meta. So what I've been doing in the meantime for the past year and a half is sharing a photo of the article on the Courier and a redirect link. So if you are following me on Facebook, I will post a redirect link. It's a workaround for Facebook. It means you have to click twice. It takes you out of Facebook and then gives you another link to click on the article. What was surprising to me is that I do that a lot, and it's so many steps to get traffic to our website that, I'm happy with the number of people that do bother. But what was really interesting this week was the number of readers that you had of that article. Thousands of people wanted to see what was going on. So what that tells me is how concerned the community is about the Starshine Properties and the SCAN operations. And I know that there was a fire after the SCAN went. So tell us a little bit more about what you learned this week and what was happening at 18 Mark Street.
So the Courier obtained an affidavit from a Justice and Public Safety officer, Ryan Cormier, who reviewed surveillance and also visited the property and issued community safety warnings prior to, the property being boarded up and seized by the Department of Justice and Public Safety. And it is worth providing some context here. 20 properties or so were purchased by an Alberta-based landlord who's been described by members of her community as an absentee landlord. These properties have been run into disrepair. They're not working. In my early days here, we interviewed several folks who talked about having their power disconnected, their water disconnected, because the bills weren't being paid and they were in the name of the landlord in question here. And the affidavit actually went so far as to say, and I don't want to misquote him, so I'm going to try to read from this paper. It says, it's apparent that the owner of the property does not or will not take control of the situation. So it speaks to this ongoing issue of an absentee landlord from another province in Alberta that has purchased properties and is not maintaining them. But some of the other things that we learned is that they started receiving complaints back in July of 2024. So this has been an ongoing thing since the summer. And some of those complaints talked about seeing individuals laying on the ground with syringes in their arms. There was a quote about a man walking around with a crossbow and arrows and a large hunting knife. And there were 8 complainants in total for this property. So it speaks to the sheer volume of the number of people who were concerned about 18 Mark Street and sort of what is happening at that property. And I cannot imagine how terrifying it would be to live near or operate a business. And Humphrey's Funeral Home operates in close proximity to that, and there's also a seniors complex right next door. So it's right in the heart of St. Stephen. So that was just some of the things that we noticed. Yeah.
And you've done some extensive work as well, looking into what SCAN operations are, how they work, how they're done. Can you illuminate us a little bit about what happens in a SCAN operation and what it ultimately means for that property?
So the SCAN operations are done as I said, by the Department of Justice and Public Safety through the Safer Communities and Neighborhoods Act. And they have a different burden of proof than in a criminal investigation. So in a criminal investigation, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. In this one, the burden of proof is a little bit less, but they do have to do extensive work. So they have to surveil the property. They have to have notable incidents that are related to what they think might be drug trafficking or drug use. And they have to produce all of this in a certain amount of time in order for a judge to give them a community safety warning. And then once those are issued, then they can then start to make moves to seize the property entirely. Now they can seize any property, commercial or residential, for 90 days. They can, at that point, terminate the leases of anyone who lives in that building, whether those tenants are legitimate or not. So unfortunately, there are going to be members of the community who are living in these properties, which 18 Mark Street had no power, no running water, and no sewer. But there were 2 people living in that property that were not involved in the drug trafficking allegations that have been made against some of the tenants. So these people would have been evicted from their home, essentially. Not much of one, but they would have been evicted from it. So it is a compounding problem. But that's what we understand about scan operations.
And obviously continuing to follow Starshine Properties. I know that you and I have both made a number of attempts to contact Starshine Properties and Pankella, the landlord who has been named. We've never met and have never been able to reach, despite many, many, many attempts.
Yeah, and the Department of Justice and Public Safety has not been able to do that either. In a prior attempt, police actually tried to make contact at her address. This time they issued a letter via Canada Post. Canada Post says it wasn't deliverable and that it could be picked up at a Canada Post location, but didn't say where that location is. And obviously this impact is so... it's so significant for such a small community. And what struck me about the affidavit is that complainants had come to the officer who was doing this investigation and said they feared for their safety, they feared for their children's safety. The seniors who live in that seniors complex across the street are afraid to go outside. And I couldn't imagine living in a circumstances where I couldn't enjoy the sunshine or I couldn't go out and enjoy some leisurely time outside. But what it does is it raises questions about tenants' rights in New Brunswick. It raises questions about out-of-province buyers of non-owner occupied properties, because how are the checks and balances in place for someone who buys a property outside of their province? How are they going to manage it? Are they collecting the tenant's rent properly? All of that is very all of those are questions that we'll seek to try to answer as we continue to cover this story.
Right, because out of province, there wouldn't be really any checks and balances, but when you can buy over 20 properties in a small community and have such a huge impact on particularly affordable housing, when we see those ramifications roll out in real time, and really they're quite measurable in a community like ours. We've even done interviews here with unhoused people who were previously residents of a Starshine property, and we're seeing it affect the community on many different levels. I imagine, what will you be looking into next as far as this goes?
Well, we're going to continue to monitor the situation. Obviously, there are several other properties that are involved in Starshine, and what councillors have said at various council meetings is that when one property gets shut down, they simply move to another. So I don't think that this problem is going to go away with the seizure of 18 Mark Street. I think it may move somewhere else, and I have heard from members of the community of an address already that they've relocated, and actually several people who were identified as subjects of previous investigations at 16 Schoodic and 9 Schoodic had relocated to 18 Mark Street. So this is a vicious cycle of activity that is really harming St. Stephen, and I am not sure how we get to the end of it, but it also speaks to the housing crisis, right? It is worth noting that the municipal district of St. Stephen has been denied again their Housing Accelerator Fund money, which would increase the housing stock, affordable housing stock, I want to mention, and they're really in the thick of it in St. Stephen in terms of housing and the housing crisis.
And I should mention too, you and I have been to a mobile home park in Utopia, where the same Starshine Properties landlord was not present, but had been the owner of a Utopia number of properties as well. So this is it's going outside of St. Stephen as well. So it's definitely something that we will continue to follow. It's a complicated issue, a very complicated issue that I think it has communities, provinces having to look at how do we negotiate these circumstances going forward when we can see something impact a small community so deeply.
And we did reach out to the tenant-landlord relations office about the Utopia properties and properties that have been impacted by NB Power withdrawing power and water, and they have provided no comment. They said that the investigation is ongoing, but the Department of Social Development declined to comment on that story. So hopefully there comes a resolution. I don't know what will come next for those properties, but we're going to continue to watch it, and if the community wants to reach out to us again, news@chco.tv.
Exactly. I think that sometimes we can't stress enough the importance of your involvement in these stories. It is those human stories that make people pay attention. We can deliver all the information we can with facts, but it is the stories of our community that I think get the attention of the powers that be to make moves that could better the situation in St. Stephen, and also not just St. Stephen, but taking those moves would have a positive impact on other communities that maybe haven't been affected, but that could be prevented down the road as well. But it really is the people that have been brave enough to tell their stories about how their lives have been impacted. You deserve all the credit for being the reason that the powers that be care and pay attention. So thank you for all of you who have reached out and have been a part of the stories we've shared, because you really are the reason why people put a spotlight on why this is so serious. It really does make a difference.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with This Week Uncut.
This room is Canada strong. Thank you, Cleo.
Welcome back to This Week Uncut. We're going to turn to federal news now. Mark Carney has been elected the leader of the Liberal Party in a landslide victory over the weekend, 85.9% of the vote. That was something I was not expecting. What did you make of his victory?
I thought it was a clear message that while I think the Liberal Party is looking for that leader that can provide hope, can provide an option, when I think that very much people thought this was a clear win for the Conservatives, I think they are picking a leader very, very much unanimously who is distinctly different from the Trudeau government. They want to break away from that. I think it was a little shocking to see how small percentage of votes that Chrystia Freeland did receive. I think that was maybe, in some ways it was shocking, but I also didn't find it surprising. I think just by how much it was, I did expect it to turn out this way. I did think that there was going to be a break from the past and looking for a new direction. I just didn't think it would be that extreme, but it definitely sent a message.
Yes, and I think he will call an election sooner rather than later. I think the NDP and the Conservatives have been very clear that they want an election and that they would not support the current minority government should they try to resume Parliament. And I think that's in everyone's best interest anyway. I think Canadians are eager to get to the ballot box, and they're eager to look at the issues and see change within their government. But I do want to take a second to just address the fact there's been some rhetoric on social media about how Mark Carney has become the Prime Minister. And in Canada, we do not elect a Prime Minister. We elect MPs. And one of those MPs is selected to be the leader of the prospective party. So in the case of the New Democratic Party, it's Jagmeet Singh. In the case of the Conservatives, it's Pierre Poilievre. In the case of the Liberals, it is now Mark Carney. So Mark Carney is not an elected official. So in that instance, no, he has not been elected, but he is leader of the party. So he actually won't be able to sit on the floor of the House, right? So he's not, we don't elect a Prime Minister in Canada. We're not like a republic like in America, where they do elect the president. And in the same way that now former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will continue to sit as an MP in the House of Commons post his resignation, because he was elected as an MP but chosen as leader of the party and therefore Prime Minister. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I think Canadians think that for some reason there's been some sort of unilateral decision that Mark Carney is Prime Minister. That's not the case. He will face, as all MPs do, his name on a ballot, and he will have to be elected as a member of Parliament. So, and in the same way that Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre will eventually, he's elected in Carleton, in the riding of Carleton. So, he is the leader of the Conservative Party. So should his government be elected, he would become the Prime Minister. He's not elected as Prime Minister. He is elected as an MP. So I just wanted to address that, because I thought it's
a very important distinction,
yes,
especially for Canadians to keep in mind. I think we, for better or worse, consume a lot of American news, and sometimes I think those realities can confuse your own governments and how your government operates. I think maybe we were relieved to see ours operate differently at this time, but I think you're right in that we want to get back to business here in Canada. It's been a very strange time to feel like we're in limbo when we're in the midst of this international trade war.
And Mark Carney did directly address Trump during his speech over the weekend.
There's someone who's trying to do the opposite. There's someone who's trying to weaken our economy. Yeah, Donald Trump. Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as we know, has put, as the Prime Minister just said, unjustified tariffs on what we build, on what we sell, on how we make a living. He's attacking Canadian families, workers, and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed. And we won't. We won't. I am proud of the response of Canadians who are making their voices heard and their wallets felt. I am grateful for how our provinces are stepping up to the fight, because when we are united, we are Canada strong. The Canadian government has rightly retaliated and is rightly retaliating with our own tariffs that will have maximum impact in the United States and minimum impact here in Canada. And my government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect. And until they can join us in making credible and reliable commitments to free and fair trade. As Krista did. Yeah. And in the meantime, we will ensure that all the proceeds from our tariffs will be used to protect our workers. Les Américains veulent nos ressources, notre eau, notre territoire, notre pays.
Our country even.
Jamais, oui. Pensez-y.
Think about that.
Pensez-y. Ça va détruire notre façon d'être.
Our way of life.
The Americans want our resources, our water, our land, our country. Think about it. If they succeeded, they would destroy our way of life. In America, healthcare is a big business. In Canada, it is a right. Thank you. America is a melting pot. Canada is a mosaic. Aux États-Unis, on ne reconnaît pas les différences. On ne reconnaît pas les Premières Nations. Et il n'y aura jamais de droit à la langue française. La joie de vivre, la culture et la langue française font partie de notre identité. Et il faut les protéger, il faut les promouvoir. On ne les échangera jamais pour n'importe quel accord commercial. Yeah. Look, America is not Canada. And Canada never, ever will be part of America in any way, shape, or form.
That was the new Liberal leader, Mark Carney, speaking to the membership of the Liberal Party over the weekend. And we have some turning back to local news now, we've got lots of things on the agenda for the upcoming week. I will be focusing primarily on St. Stephen Council, which has just had a committee meeting. Some of you may note that we've already published a story about the Housing Accelerator Fund, which we mentioned earlier in the show. There's some other very interesting things, some policies that they're looking at. They're looking at a rebranding. They're looking at an incentive package for physicians. All of these things very interesting. And then Eastern Charlotte is also coming up this week. So we've got a jam-packed week ahead of us in local news.
Jam-packed. I will be getting over to Campobello this week. It is my promise to the island to see firsthand how you're being impacted by the tariffs. I'm very much looking forward to it. And if we have more questions, again, we will be in Susan Holt's Thursday conferences. It's Thursday at noon going forward until this trade war is over. So if you have your questions for that, again, we have about 2 questions we're able to ask at any given conference. So we will make sure that we ask the ones that are most relevant to the community. So news at CHCO-TV. I don't think we can stress this enough. It is the most important part about our jobs, is talking directly to the community and finding out what matters to you and making sure we get you answers.
Exactly, and we will continue to do so long as we are able to. I'm excited to see what the folks on Campobello Island are going to say. I think that they offer a unique perspective to Canadian sovereignty.
It's a very interesting time to be in this part of the world, but if you are a person who's actually living on the island, it's a very scary time as well. It impacts them every single day.
And hopefully we'll also be heading to Deer Island. I've got some stuff on the go on Deer Island, so yet another Charlotte County island about the end of lobster season. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of spread out and get to all aspects of Charlotte County.
I should mention, and I will be going to Grand Manan soon too. I don't have a date in mind, but Kyle the Drifter, I haven't forgotten about you and your cold plunge challenge that I think is in this day 70 something now. I've been following it every single day. So I know that he's raising money for the food bank, such a beautiful initiative. He's got all the islanders involved following him as well on his journey. I know it's getting a little warmer, so I want to make sure I get over to the island while it's still cold to see it. And in its glory, I know Kyle's a good sport and such a fun guy, and I appreciate what he's doing. So I think it's time to shine a light on something positive too. So it's nice to do a good news story once in a while.
Thanks for watching this week Uncut. I'm Nathalie Sturgeon.
And I'm Vicki Hogarth. We'll see you next time.